there have been numerous events that have challenged our faith in the justice system, our political system, our educational system, even our economic system for that matter. In fact, in every area of our lives, African Americans have been affected in some way. So tonight we're going to take a look at the events of 2015 and how those events are going to impact African Americans this year. With the presidential election in full swing, the future of African Americans is certainly something we need to be concerned with as African Americans. To help me explore the future of African Americans and what can happen or what the landscape is going to look like this year with the events of last year and already some of the things that we've witnessed in 2016 is investigative reporter from the Washington Post, Kimbriell Kelly. She first started her career in Chicago as a staff writer and editor of the Chicago Reporter. She is currently, as I mentioned, an investigative reporter for the Washington Post, as well as our returning guest who's always with us because we certainly appreciate his time and efforts, is Tom Morris Jr., former America's Most Wanted senior correspondent, political analyst with the Capitol Hill Blues, and anti-terrorism expert. As you also know, he is the America's Most Wanted senior correspondent, having a 95% capture rate, fugitive captive rate during that time when he was there with America's Most Wanted. So please help me in please join me in welcoming my guests to the show, Kimbriell and Tom. Welcome to the show, you guys.
Thank you.
We survive as a race or culture just by talking about the injustices, or do we need to begin to take meaningful action?
This call with Tamir Rice that LeBron get more involved, that he say something about it, and he's made statements about incidents that affect African Americans before in the past, and so people were really calling on him to step in again with the Tamir Rice decision, and in some regards, assist in the fight to get additional justice for which people said more justice was needed. And basically he said, well, I'm a little unfamiliar. He did not come out with a statement. So Lene kind of pushes back and says, well, what about all these other people? We can call on athletes and big figures to make a statement, call on Black Lives Matter or some other group or person, but really she's calling for, personal responsibility. Where do individuals have an opportunity to insert themselves in the conversation and change the circumstance as well? So I think, can things change in the future? How should things change? I think the point that Lene is trying to stress is, if you can't change the system or you can't force somebody else to change the system, what culpability and responsibility do you have and can you contribute to changing it?
The justice system, the elections, the process of the elections and everything we do it's always tainted. Because everyone thinks that politics is corrupt and there's so much. I mean, we're not talking about Chicago. We're just looking overall, and that's just something.
Don't get me started on that.
Right. But you're right, because we don't participate in the non-presidential elections where the mayors, the governors, and everyone are elected, the judges and people like that. And so when you look at that, Kimbriell, what is required of us? I mean, when we look at our pastors and we look at our local communities, your brothers and sisters, your friends, teachers, police officers, that's area where most of us are living in the community, are doing what we have to do, that responsibility falls on them. But does it also fall on us to make sure that we hold them accountable, or are we our brother's keeper? Shouldn't we make sure that we do or tell them and invite them, do something the same way we invite them to the party, invite them to the poll, invite them to a Black Lives Matter movement, invite them to other areas that actually impact their lives and has an impact on their community?
I mean, to answer the question of what is required, and I will take a little step back to address what Tom had talked about with voting. Vanessa Williams, she's a very talented writer at the Washington Post, and she has an article in today's newspaper that addresses the power of the Black woman in voting. And she basically lays out a list of numbers, and don't quote me on this, but I believe that Black women were like 4 times more likely to vote than any other group and were the largest voting bloc. in the most recent, presidential elections. And so I think that speaks volume, that there's the potential. And obviously, Barack Obama is African American and he was up for election. But, having strong voter bases, people are trying to figure out, can that happen again in this upcoming election? And speaking to your point, will that happen in local races? Now, being from Chicago, people vote.
Right,
There's a lot of political history in Chicago. But I think, what's required of people, me as my job, I've worked around reporting around issues of race for a very, very long time, since I was in my early 20s. And I'm not in my 20s anymore.
She's in her 30s anymore.
Actually, I'm not in my 30s anymore
Follow
either.
us on Periscope. You can see she's in her 30s.
I'm not, actually.
Okay, really?
I'm older than that. But anyway, we won't go there. I think he just went speechless. But, yes, I am in my 40s. But, so I think I've been reporting on these all the time, and you say, well, how can people be helped? And I think educating, understanding what's really at play in terms of numbers. I used to always say to people when I would go talk to students, they would say, is this racism? Is that racism? Did you prove that with your story? And I would say, I can't prove that something's racist or not. But what I can do is show statistics for something.
Right.
I can show what the realities are.
Right.
And so back then I was writing about the realities about African Americans and minorities when it came to mortgage lending. And I was showing, I had a guy, he was earning six figures in the 1990s straight out of school, and he wanted to buy a piece of property in Chicago on the south side. And the property cost, I think it was $40,000. And he did not get approved for the loan. Making six figures, black guy, $40,000. And then he went to another community and he was able to get approved. And so I ended up writing the story saying, well, if you're making a lot of money and you're black, is the system for mortgage lending fair? Right. So I ended up doing this whole analysis, which, writing then ended up showing the disparity between African Americans and non-African Americans in terms of mortgage lending. And I think the same holds true now with the justice system. We're taking a look at these communities like Ferguson, like Cleveland, and we're breaking down these numbers and saying, well, one, what's happening to these officers? What's happening to the victims? Are the victims predominantly African American? Are they predominantly male? And one of the things that we looked at the Post with our year-long series of police shootings is that there were some trends when it came to race. A majority of the people, when you look at the whole number of people who were victims this year, there were about nearly 1,000 people who were shot and killed by police in 2015. A vast majority of people were saying, well, we're white. And I said, okay, wait, hold on, stop the presses. Of course, the largest population of people in this country are white. So let's try to change these numbers and look at rate. Because when you balance things out by the population, things are a little bit more balanced. And so we took a look at those numbers, and statistically what we ended up finding out is that 3 times as many victims were African American than were white. So while whites were the general population of those who were victims of police fatal shootings, African Americans made up the largest lot when you looked at the rate in those communities that were impacted. And so that's what I mean when you're finding out these things, you're looking at the disparities, and you let the numbers kind of speak for themselves. And then people take those things and they file lawsuits, and then you create change. It changes things in the voting booths and things like that.
And that's, I think, where is going to be the state of our community if we keep going like this and we get, African Americans getting killed, white officers doing the killing, or black officers for that matter, and then nothing happens to them. What's going to happen in our community? I mean, truly, in my opinion, a revolution is going to get started somehow or another. But how is that going to be affected, or how is that going to transpire come this year? This is going to be a very tense political year. It's going to be a very racially charged year already. So what's going to happen?
Basically upheld Graham versus Connor, which says basically that the reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, as opposed to 20/20 hindsight. Now, to most people, what he did seems like a scene out of Lethal Weapon with Mel Gibson, where you just shooting and shooting and shooting. I mean, I'm a trained law enforcement officer. I've never been taught to fire 43 rounds. We're supposed to shoot until the threat is stopped.
Me either.
Also, you had sort of a perfect storm of everything that could go wrong went wrong. Their car backfired, the police thought they were shooting at them. Then they led the police on a 22-mile chase, which, you know, that old song, I fought the law and the law won, is always going to be that way. You only beat the law in court. You don't beat the law on the curb and on the street. And I think we need to educate people to make better decisions, too, because the police have the power and the authority to shoot you. And that's just a fact of life. And it's always going to be a fact of life. And when you see people that make really bad decisions that bring them into the crosshairs of the police, who then themselves aren't exercising good judgment and good discipline, like the shooting of that woman a couple of weeks ago in Chicago when the father called for the boy who was being disruptive and had some mental illness, and they come and shoot the neighbor who opened the door for her. I mean, that's just unacceptable. But at the same time, people have to realize that the decisions you make can put you in the crosshairs, whether it's right or wrong.
There's a percentage of the people, in terms of the shootings that we looked at, the nearly 1,000, 1 in 4, which is not a small number, 1 in 4 were people who were mentally ill.
Right, right.
And so, I mean, I think that when you're dealing with a population like that too, then it becomes a question of how do you address the issue to maybe use a lesser use of force. And I think that is starting to become a greater part of the conversation now too. You see this happening in Albuquerque. The Department of Justice has gone in and basically said, you have a problem dealing with the mentally ill. And you see it case after case where, there's a victim who may be young or out in the desert, and we heard it all over the last couple of years, and they're shot and killed by police because they had what was either a weapon or what was perceived to be a weapon.
Right.
And so I think increasingly you have an issue where people may not have the mental capabilities to make maybe the most sound choices. And a perfect example was the Brillo case with Officer Brillo in Cleveland as well. I believe both of the victims were not only homeless or in and out of shelters, but they were both mentally ill and had a long history of mental illness. And so I think I would just push back a little bit and say...
But I can receive what you're trying to say or what you're saying, but isn't that still the responsibility of the law enforcement to deal with that? Because you may not know I'm mentally ill, but at the same time, like Tom said, there is a progression of lethal force. Exactly. And to just blindly shoot 103 times into a vehicle that has not shot back to you, even in that entire 22-minute speed chase that was not necessarily speeding, it was like the old OJ chase, you didn't get anyone shooting at you, you had no one shooting at you, and then when they finally stopped, they didn't get out of the car, they didn't shoot, they didn't do anything. I think that still is a responsibility of law enforcement. Granted, they need to be trained better or what have you if we're going to say or give them that excuse.
And you have the justice system coming up and agreeing. They're saying, and they're looking at Cleveland, but this is the problem too. And I've said this before, people, the Department of Justice happened a few weeks ago, said that they're going to come in and investigate Chicago, right? People get really excited. Wow, finally, justice is going to be served. These investigations take 12 to 18 months to even come out with
a good year.
They could, if not more. Tamir Rice, not Tamir Rice, the Ferguson case was a little bit different. It was about 6 months, so it was an anomaly. But generally, it's like a year and a half before the Justice Department comes out and says something.
Right.
They may come out and do nothing at all and say, okay, we found some stuff, but it's not as egregious as requiring some complete reform of the police department. But the bottom line is this: there are more than 15,000 police departments in this country, and you are probably very well aware of this. The Justice Department in the last 20 years, since Congress gave it authority to investigate police departments, have investigated 67. So you don't have to be a math genius to figure out there are 15,067 investigations. So yes, to answer your question, justice does come in, they see violations, they see that the police departments aren't doing certain things the way they need to. There needs to be new training, there needs to be new policies. Use of force,
a whole bunch of policies.
The definition of use of force has changed over the years, and it's different from department to department. I've interviewed
it's like what Tom was saying, because it's in the perception of the officer, and therefore he can easily say, which we've witnessed to the chagrin of what the facts are, they were reaching for a weapon, or he took my taser, or he had a gun, and he came after me with Laquan McDonald. He was coming at me. Clearly he was. But then 16 shots. You know, the over excessiveness. He took my taser, 8 shots in the back. You know, he did this. As soon as you roll up on Tamir Rice, if you're a cop, you're trained not to roll up on the suspect. You jump out and you just pop him as soon as you get out of the car. All those things are the in my opinion, the lack of respect for those victims, and then in some cases just the pure idiocy of just the individuals going out there and just saying, okay, well, since I got the gun, let me just empty it out in you, and therefore I can make sure you're not moving.
As far as dealing with the Republican candidates, it's the silence from them on Black Lives Matter is deafening. I have not heard a Republican person really yet say anything that endorsed even the root causes of why Black Lives Matter even exist. Donald Trump, as we know, has literally had people beaten up at his rallies for even showing up for Black Lives Matter, and then touting that they deserve to be beaten, which is astonishing when you're running for president of the United States in the 21st century. But I think that the movement will continue to grow throughout the election year. I do think that some of the economic impact things, although economic impacts, like Jesse Jackson was a master at one point of getting corporations to boycotting corporations to get them to employ more African Americans, to do something that would benefit the African American customers that they were making so much money off of. I think that in some ways in Chicago, shutting down the Miracle Mile, while it may be effective in terms of disrupting the city, I think it makes a lot of people look at the movement as a little out of control. Like, is that really the best use of your energies? Is to shut down a bunch of stores so people have to go to work and make money every day to pay their own bills.
Turn to the issue of Justice Scalia and his comments about African Americans and education, and the fact that they shouldn't try to seek admissions into the University of Texas or any school of its caliber because it doesn't benefit them, because we're not capable of succeeding at those universities. And he says, and I quote, but we should only strive to attend a lesser caliber school. Scalia said that there were people who would contend that it does not benefit African Americans to get into the University of Texas where they do not do well, as opposed to having them go to a lesser advanced school, a slower track school where they do well. So I'm gonna give this, Tom, I know that you
I think that Justice Scalia is a perfect example of why the Constitution needs to be revisited about Supreme Court judges being appointed for life. I think that really and truly, we've seen some things over the last, since the Reagan administration, we've seen some things that really make you scratch your head and say, is this really the best way to do this? That the guy just gets on the court and stays there till he dies, no matter how racist or crazy or just off the wall even. I mean, Scalia said so many things that were offensive over the course of his tenure, and yet this man is weighing in on decisions that affect the entire nation. And it really kind of upsets me because I don't think somebody like that should be able to stay on the court until he dies.
And that was going to be my question, because when you're talking about someone who has the power of the pen and the power of being able to affect legislation and deal with issues affecting the entire country, but more importantly, us as African Americans and the impact of that, how do we, Kimbriell, how do we allow someone, because first of all, they're supposed to be apolitical. They're not supposed to be political at all. But yet you have someone who speaks out and routinely speaks out against minorities, African Americans, and Latinos, and any other minority group you want to talk about, that just causes you to cringe and recognize that this is a Supreme Court justice who is going to be voting on those cases that are coming before him. I mean, how do we continue to allow that to occur? And like Tom said, it's certainly there needs to be a constitutional amendment that is probably not going to come. But how do we deal with someone like that? How do we continue to allow it to happen? But more importantly, how do we deal with it?
I mean, I think you see with movements where people get together and they make change. You have to change laws to be able to change, to change people, to oust judges, to change process. And I think you're seeing that a lot with the police shootings also. A lot of what's happening is in the court of law, most of these officers are getting acquitted, not because it's like a lawyer didn't believe that they didn't do something wrong, but the way the legal system and the law is set up, it's very protective also.
How do we do that? How do we make sure that another Justice Scalia doesn't get on the bench?
I think that's a question for somebody like Jeffrey Toobin, CNN's, constitutional scholar, because I honestly don't know. I mean, I don't think there's a real appetite out there amongst the general population, because I don't think that unless the courts are hearing something monumental like abortion or something that really affects everyone. His comments about blacks are going to colleges because we're not as smart as white people, that still doesn't really matter to the heartland of American people out there, to the point where they're like, hey, maybe we need to look at the Constitution and see if people shouldn't be able to stay on the court forever. A lot of people just simply don't care that much until it's an issue that affects them, like when unions are being debated before the court as to whether or not people can be forced to pay dues in the union. Scalia is very much anti-union. He has been, and unions are the only thing protecting the middle class at this point, really, are the small percentage of unionized workers that are in this country now.
Well, they're going to work to overturn that at every state. I mean, after Scott Walker got busted the union in Wisconsin, you saw Chris Christie go after the unions. You saw them go after the unions in Kansas City, Missouri. Every Republican governor out there, Florida, they went after the unions everywhere because that was their way of busting out to make sure that they can, fight the whole electoral process of the unions, because they want to get rid of the money out of the union base. But when you're looking at justice, we're looking at the courts, period, because truly, the appetite isn't there for anyone to do anything about it. But how do we just sit back and allow someone like this to continue to target, if you will, African Americans? Kimbriell, how do you? I'm with Tom. It kind of frustrates me and pisses me off, because I'm like, this dude is sitting there with his arms folded, his arms crossed, and just leaning back saying, well, you know what? I don't think she should go to that school anyway, Kimbriell, because you know what? You're not smart enough to pass. You're inferior to white people. You're inferior. It really, I wish I could see him on the street, I mean, it frustrates me to no end, and then it pisses me off to the other end, because this man is judging cases that are affecting the livelihood of many African Americans, every African American on that court, on that bench. I mean, he's affecting what happens to us.
Yes.
Right. It's like, what do we say about it?
I don't know what you can say about it. I mean, I think if anybody has a different opinion than any of the justices, which I think most people are probably unfamiliar with the stances of most of the justices until a comment like that is made,
right,
and reverberates throughout the nation. But I think then you look back and say, well, I'm glad there's more than one.
The Black Lives Matter movement has to continue to grow. I think it wouldn't be a bad idea for them to maybe camp out in front of the Supreme Court until see what happens if they just stay there like Jesse Jackson when he made the tent city back in '69. Just camp out until something happens. But I think that as time goes by in 2016, you're going to see Donald Trump be the best thing that ever happened to mobilizing people of good reason, of good will, of all races and colors, because this guy is actually he's actually the best thing that's ever happened to rational political thought in this country in some ways, because he's completely just a carnival barker, just out there saying the most racist things. And I think that he's going to make sure that people realize the Republican Party does not care about black people and never has. And that's why Donald Trump is being as successful in the polls among the Republicans as he is. And I think that he is going to mobilize people in a way that nobody else can to come out and vote to make sure they don't get in the White House.
Kimbriell, what's going to be the impact of what we've seen and looking forward to 2016?
I think some of the things that we can look forward to in 2016, outside of more from the Black Lives Matter. One thing that we really didn't talk a lot about today, which is actually economics and finances.
Right.
And I think that's actually going to be a big, huge issue as we continue to see the middle class shrink, where a lot of African Americans are. And particularly, there's more research coming out about the black millennials, one, being saddled with a lot of college debt that they can't afford, two, not getting the jobs that are paying a lot of money, and three, having to take care of their families and their parents who also didn't have a lot of money. And so you're actually seeing African Americans who are younger already getting into a debt cycle early on, and so it's widening the rift between various racial groups. So I think
that's a perfect segue, so we can have you back to discuss all that.
I would love to talk about that. So I think those are some of the big things, as well as voting rights.
Right, that's coming up again too. Alabama's done something. We were talking about that last week, so that's going to be a show that we're going to do as well, because those are the areas that really I'm so passionate about. That just I just want to strangle people to understand what's going on. So very quickly, we got about a minute and a half. What's at stake? What's at stake in 2016 for African Americans?
Oh gosh, there's so much at stake, too much to list. Jobs, education, money, and although I think that one of the things you see with Black Lives Matter too is more cohesion for African Americans, more solidarity.
Yeah, absolutely. Tom, what's at stake?
I think that everyone's got to continue to be involved. The movements that have been started need to grow. People need to be focused on how they go about making the difference with these movements. And I think that we've got to mobilize people to really pay attention to the electoral process. The fact that we got Barack Obama elected president twice was lightning in a bottle that struck twice. We don't know what's going to happen this time around, and we really can't afford to take a huge step backwards by letting someone who really represents just an angry small percentage of angry white, disenfranchised, uneducated white people get into the White House.
So, Kimbriell, how can our listeners get in contact with you, follow you, and carry on to listen and read some of your articles? And I want to tell everyone, do go to her Twitter account or website or wherever she's about to tell us to do, because I've read some of her articles. They're very good. That's one of the reasons why we need to have her back on the show. So go ahead, Kim. How can we get in contact with you?
Thank you. You can follow me on Twitter, Kimbriell Wapo, and send me an email. Go to WashingtonPost.com and just type in my name. It's like Kimberly and Gabrielle put together, so Kimbriell.
All right. Tom, how can we get in contact? How can we get in contact with
you? And #1 on Twitter.
Say it again. Say it again for me.
Tom Morris Jr. 1, the #1 on Twitter.
I want to thank my guest, Tom Morris Jr., Kimbriell Kelly, for joining us tonight. And as always, as I say to you, what's at stake for you and your family? Because we all know that there's something at stake. And no matter what it is, it's for you. So make sure that you try to empower yourself, educate yourself, and understand whatever it is that is most important to you, that you go out there and fight for it. And you don't let anyone take it away from you, and you don't let anyone just tell you what you can't do. Justice Scalia telling you that you're not able to go to the University of Texas, go to the University of Texas. In fact, go to Harvard and make sure you let yourself know and everyone else know that you are more than better than anyone else that he can ever come up with, and you're not inferior to anyone in this country. Until next time, if it's social, economic, or political, it's Black Politics Today. I want to thank you once again for listening in. Join us next time as we look at everything that's going on across the country, because we want to make sure that everyone has a power to be and do whatever they want to do. Thank you once again.